And welcome to the show. We're doing something a little unusual, something we decided to do sometime around Tuesday or Wednesday when we realized that this was indeed going to be a disorienting and demoralizing stretch of time. And we were right. And there may even be more disorientation to come over the weekend. And I sensed in myself and in other people a despondency and almost a hopelessness. And I didn't like that idea. And I thought we should talk to people that we've talked to in the past who are very, very good at seeing the way in which, in particular, I think imagination works to create new horizons of hope. And we're going to do that today. Everybody who's on the show today is someone I've talked to before. Our first guest is someone I've talked to many times before, often for just a whole 1 hour show. We're going to go a little faster today with Azar Nafisi, the author of 6 books, including Reading Lolita in Tehran, her newest, Read Dangerously, The Subversive Power of Literature in Troubled Times, maybe most significantly for the conversation we're about to have, a book called The Republic of Imagination. So, Azar, well, first of all, welcome back to our show.
It's wonderful to be back. Thank you, Colin.
You know, I think early on in our conversation relationship, there was kind of a premise, particularly after the 2016 election, that with your background in navigating life in an authoritarian state before, as an Iranian American, that you had a kind of preparation that maybe other people didn't have for things that might be on the horizon. But I'm almost wondering whether that makes any sense anymore. I mean, I'm wondering if you feel as though living in America, you're seeing things that nothing could have prepared you for.
Well, yes, you're right. I mean, when I returned to America, I felt that things were not as they could be or they should be. Especially in regards to imagination and ideas that were either neglected or under attack. And you know the saying that says, first they burn books, then they kill people. So the censorship and that sort of mindset is a warning of what is to come. So I was always anxious a little. And 2016 confirmed the legitimacy of my anxiety, But you mentioned hope. I think when a country or a nation or an individual is in crisis, there are 2 sides to it. One is a crisis can become dangerous, it can become chaotic and swallow us all. Or it can lead to self-questioning, lead to doubt, lead to the need for a new exchange, for a new renewal of exchanges. And so it could go either way, depending on us, what we choose to do.
I know also that one of the roles that you see literature as having, and I think we could even expand from literature, we'll be talking on the show today to, for example, a sculptor who makes very, very powerful work, and to a musician who composes both out of his heart and out of his concern for society. But one of the things that all imaginative work can do, I think, is to help us think in a more complex way. I mean, Pontius Pilate is just a person with a role in the Bible, unless a novelist or poet or someone else comes along and says, well, what was it like to be Pontius Pilate? What else could Pontius Pilate have been thinking about at that moment? And suddenly a bigger conversation starts.
Well, there are 2 very human and humane traits, which are the foundation of any imaginative work. And the first one is curiosity. And I always remember Nabokov saying curiosity is insubordination in its purest form. That whole desire which fiction creates in wanting to know the other, in wanting to go under the skin of the other, wanting to connect to others. So curiosity leads to empathy. And the second thing about imagination, which makes it actually dangerous, and which I see it in terms of the two places I called home, both America and Iran, is the fact that it is universal, that it transcends the limitations that reality puts upon us, transcends the limitations of nationality, race, gender, ethnicity, religion. And it, at some point, it connects us to one to the other. And it becomes dangerous. It becomes dangerous. And it also becomes dangerous because imagination reveals the truth. And truth is always dangerous, because once you know it, you cannot remain silent, or you have betrayed yourself. And that is why tyrants, whether they live in America or in Iran, hate imagination and ideas. As you said, it's both complicated and complex, as well as liberating and truthful.
You know, there's a drawing that's been circulating around on social media, and I had it up myself, and it relates to what's called Project 2025, which we believe is kind of a blueprint that might be used for a change of power in January of 2025. But the drawing is a series of Venn diagram circles that has 1984 and Animal Farm and Fahrenheit 451 and Soylent Green, Brave New World, A Handmaid's Tale, The Matrix. There are a few, Lord of the Flies. There are Clockwork Orange. There are a whole bunch of them. And kind of in the middle of all that, with all of the circles overlapping onto it, is Project 2025. And it is true that our imaginative writers are very, very good at imagining dystopian futures.
Yeah.
And maybe say a little bit about that, and then I have a follow-up.
Well, you know, you have Ray Bradbury, who in 1950s was talking about the dangers of the reality that we were living in. In many ways, fiction, the best of it, predicts the future. And these books you mentioned, each in their own way and in the most extreme way, predict what we could become and what we should become as well as that.
Yeah, I want to come back to the should, because I wonder if we're maybe not as good as we need to be at the should part. I think we're very good, or our writers and thinkers are very good at imagining dystopia. I wonder if we need to be better at imagining the world we do want to live in. I think I see less of that, of the world that would be possible to live in almost no matter what station in life you were born into.
Yeah, you're right. We sort of close our eyes to that world and ignore it. And right now, we're paying a very high price for it. You know, I was thinking of the power of fiction, and I was reminded of Salman Rushdie. Now, the question that I keep going back to every time I think of Salman Rushdie's case is, what is it about a human being whose only weapons are words, who has no guns, no military behind him? What is it about him that makes him so dangerous to one of the most powerful men on earth? For that powerful man wants to eliminate him in order for himself to continue life. That is how dangerous truth becomes to not just the tyrants, but people like ourselves. You know, we take it hard on others and easy on ourselves. I wanted to remind us of James Baldwin saying, art is here to disturb the peace. And that makes art very dangerous, disturbing the peace.
For me, it's also very important to have. I mean, it's always interesting to know what books we have within an arm's length of where we're usually sitting. And so in my office, one thing I can very easily reach is a volume of Walt Whitman's poetry, because I think Whitman, although he is a disturber of the peace, he's also, he's an ecstatic, he's the person who gets excited about the world that he wants to live in and he wants to believe he is living in. And I don't ever want to let go of that, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right, and Whitman is very relevant to us today. He should be quote unquote resurrected. I think. I'm reminded of what you talk about, the relationship between fiction and reality. I'm reminded of Alice in Wonderland. Mm-hmm. You remember that, of course, she's very curious. She runs after the wild rabbit and down the hall without thinking what will happen to her. She's ready to embrace what is there. And you notice that everything in the Wonderland is like the things Alice sees in reality, but only with a difference. So that when she goes back to reality, she looks at the world through these alternative eyes of fiction. And she finds out things about reality that she had been surrounded with, but not paid attention to. Fiction brings our attention back to what is real and to the consequences of that we will suffer if we don't pay attention to it.
Yeah, we're almost out of time here, but I think an important aspect of that, too, is an autocratic regime or an autocrat will say there are two choices. One is this terrible set of things that either exists right now or can come into existence. And the other thing is me. I can save you from that existence. And I think imagination, as you're suggesting, says, well, no, there aren't two possibilities. There's an infinite number of possibilities. And I think that's very scary to the autocrat.
You're very right. The autocrat, totalitarianism has its perks. And one of the perks is what you were talking about, what the autocrat promises. He promises people that they don't have to think. They don't have to imagine a future or a present, that all they have to do is to listen to him and submit to him their heart and soul. And that is why autocracy and imagination are constantly at war, because the autocrat is worried that his true face will surface through fiction. And when I was writing my most recent book, I was reading writers like Toni Morrison and Margaret Atwood, who were banned by some here in the United States. And their sin is that they offer the real reality, while the autocrat offers the fake one.
We're going to stop there. I could go on with you for quite a long time. It's good to hear your voice again. Azar Nafisi, author of 6 books, most recently Read Dangerously, The Subversive Power of Literature in Troubled Times. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure.
Yes, for me too. We'll take a little break. We'll come back. We'll meet 2 more people who've done some thinking about all this.
He was just an American dream. He was just an American dream.
sharp about the cutting edge. If they build a wall, let's jump the fence. I'm over this. Cold stairs can never put the fear in me.
I do recommend listening to the entirety of that song. It's called King James by Anderson .Paak. It's got a lot in it. All right, so we're going to talk now to the Reverend Benjamin Perry, who's been with us before on a show about crying. The Reverend Benjamin Perry is a minister of outreach and media strategy at Middle Church and the author of Cry, Baby, Why Our Tears Matter. So, yes, we wanted to talk about hope, and we wanted to talk about despair. We wanted to talk about it in a number of contexts, including a faith context. So, I don't know, when I say the word hope to you, Benjamin Perry, what do you say back to me?
Thanks, Colin, for having me back on the show.
Sure.
I think one of the real problems when we talk about hope and despair is that we're oftentimes offered either people who tell us just how bad everything is, this very unmitigated despair, or we're offered this Pollyanna-ish hope that doesn't contend with any of those realities. I think about the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer has a very famous analogy about cheap versus costly grace, that cheap grace is grace that doesn't contend with the realities of sin in the world. And I think that that's true about hope, that so often we're offered this cheap hope that doesn't grapple with the amount of despair that people are carrying around in their bodies. And so I think the kind of costly hope, the kind of hope that actually nurtures change, transformation, connection, is hope that really contends with the amount of pain that people are moving through in their lives, the loneliness, the isolation, the feelings that things just seem to get more and more chaotic, worse and worse. I saw a poll the other day that said something like 4 in 5 Americans believe that our country is spiraling into chaos, which is, feels right in my own body, but what a dramatic state of affairs to find ourselves in. And so I think if we're going to talk about what does it mean to find hope right now, it has to begin with confronting the calamity in which we find ourselves.
That's true. And that poll also, it feels like it could be a self-fulfilling collective prophecy too. If so many people believe we're spiraling into chaos, that almost means that we could on the strength of that. But I like what you're saying right now. I think it's really important. And I think it's an easy thing to gloss over, which is, yes, just have some hope, have some faith. And you're saying, well, you can't really do that until you've looked pretty hard at the pain, at the darkness.
Yeah.
If you move
away from that pain place too quickly, you're not really giving yourself the chance to muster that real embodied hope. It's one of the reasons why I like to talk about crying so much, because I think crying is this opportunity to take some of that emotion into our bodies, to let it physically move through us. As the tears pour out, you can feel yourself being emptied of that kind of despair that has just been sitting lodged in your chest. There is something shaking up in that experience of weeping. And it doesn't mean that you immediately feel better, but I think it creates the circumstances for that kind of subsequent transformation. I can offer a little analogy from Dolly Parton's life, actually. This is a story that she tells on the podcast Dolly Parton's America, where she talks about when she left the Porter Wagoner show and she, dramatically quit. And Porter Wagoner basically told her, you're never going to work in this town again. You're never going to sing. You'll never be on the radio. This is the end of it for you. And she drove home and she was just weeping. She said she broke down in the car, and somewhere in the middle of that weeping is where all of a sudden the song Light of a Clear Blue Morning burst into her head, almost fully formed, she says, to the point where she got home, she wrote it down, and that was her first #1 single by herself. Sometimes you need to let your body physically move into that space of fully confronting the pain that you are experiencing if you want to transcend it, if you want to find something on the other side.
It seems as though it's interesting too, because we're talking on Friday. I cried on the air yesterday, and before crying on the air, it was over a note that my son had written and placed in the coffin of his grandfather, my father. And I earlier in the day had told that story to my therapist, and I cried then too. And she just said, "Why did you cry?" And that's a really interesting question. I mean, I knew right away, but I hadn't really asked myself that question. I think we're so uncomfortable with vulnerability. We want to just get past it and move on to the next thing.
Well, and I think one of the the things we discover when we ask that question, or why are we crying, which I hugely commend people to do when they start to cry, because so often we'll find that actually the proximate cause of what we're crying about isn't necessarily the only reason why we're crying. That yes, we may be crying because of this concrete thing that just happened, but if we scratch a little bit below the surface, we may find that it's actually this deep reservoir of hurt or anxiety or fear, all of these things that have been pent up within us that we're actually motivating our tears. It's not just that primary cause that just happened in our lives. And I think that if we don't allow ourselves to go into that place of emotional honesty, we keep so much of that papered up. There's this real temptation towards numbness, particularly in these despairing times. That despair can feel so overwhelming that the temptation is to instead just paper over it with being all right. How are you doing? Oh, I'm fine. And most of us can be fine most of the time. We can be really, really good at cultivating that fineness. But I don't want to be fine. And I don't think you do either. I think most of the people listening right now, you want to be more than fine, do you not? And if we want to be more than all right, if we want to be more than numb or just skating over the enormity of our pain, that requires delving into the fullness of what we are feeling.
I think it's also something that we don't validate or valorize very much. I'm even thinking of, you may not have watched it, but I watched Thursday Night of the Convention last night as we're talking today. Yeah, and in the run up, there was first of all a lot of talk about fighting. There was Hulk Hogan, the former president, was introduced.
Tearing his shirt off. It was a whole thing.
Yes, and there's also Kid Rock, followed by this guy who's the CEO of some kind of Ultimate Fighting Championship, and then you had President Trump, who, he was shot at, and it was a near miss, and it seemed as though the narrative was what a badass. I mean, that term was used. What a badass Donald Trump was. I almost felt, just even to have any sense that I was dealing with a real person, I really wanted to hear a little bit of how shaken this man must have been. At the end of this, and how difficult it might have been to go in front of another audience last night.
And I think throughout last night's proceedings, what you saw was a very particular kind of strength, of bravado, of, fight, 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 literally the entire audience chanting that. This is a form of strength that has deep well in American culture. It has deep roots in the kind of fascist uprising we see throughout our streets. What I'm really curious about is, can we cultivate a kind of strength that is rooted in vulnerability? That's why I talk about crying. It's why I preach a gospel of gentleness, if you will, because I think that there is a kind of strength that is actually much deeper and more resilient than that brittle fight, fight, fight that we see. I think that fight, fight, fight comes in large part from a feeling of fear. I think that so much of that bravado comes from folks who feel like the country is slipping away from them, that the power they once enjoyed has become brittle, that they don't recognize the country around them. And as much as I can cultivate empathy for that, I can understand that feeling of fear and anxiety. But I think the real harm comes from when, instead of dealing with those feelings of fear, of anxiety, that people run in the opposite direction and cultivate this fighting ethos. Yeah, the ultimate fighter, Hulk Hogan tearing his shirt off, all of this rage, this animosity, this feeling of, if we can be a little bit tougher, we can move through this. When in reality, I think that if we're honest about the kind of hope that will reconnect communities, that draw people closer to their neighbor, that draw us closer to ourselves, that confront the full magnitude of what we're facing, it's going to require softness, and it's going to require grief in a large part. I mean, it was interesting. I was hearing, they were also talking about like drill, baby, drill. I talk a lot about climate grief because I think it's really important, when we're looking at this climate crisis, there really aren't there are sort of two ways that you can go. You can either pretend, drill, baby, drill, like this isn't happening. This is all a lie. The massive storms that wrecked my town last winter, those were just an anomaly in the way that the previous year's massive storms were, and the way that the previous year's, we can pretend that all of this isn't happening to us, and we can get ourselves deeper and deeper into the problem. Or we can actually confront the grief of, yes, we are facing a somewhat intractable problem, and we might not be able to overcome it in the way that we are used to overcoming things. We may need to learn to adapt. But that act of vulnerability, of opening ourselves to what we are feeling and the fear of our neighbor, is what hopefully will pull us together so that we can cultivate the kind of collective response that helps us transcend it.
It's a beautiful place to end. The Reverend Benjamin Perry, Minister of Outreach and Media Strategy at Middle Church, the author of Cry, Baby, Why Our Tears Matter. We're going to transition quickly to a very, very old friend and colleague of mine. I'm not saying he's old. I'm just saying our friendship is old. Gene Seymour is writer, a professional spectator, pop culture maven, and jazz geek. He's on with us under all kinds of circumstances, including this one. Gene, how are you doing?
I'm doing, Colin. I'm trying to not to feel old and optimistic. And I think most of what I do is to protect that optimism, what little of it I have left. So,
well, you and I, we broke into journalism at basically the same time and together. And
right.
We grew up with a certain kind of, or we grew old with a kind of a set of rules.
Yes.
And one of the rules is you can't shrink from anything. You have to watch everything. You have to be the eyes and ears of the world. And I think you and I had a similar moment this week. I'll start so you'll feel more comfortable saying this, but I think it was on Tuesday night. I watched A Hard Day's Night just because I wanted the four lads and Richard Lester just to make me happy in a way that was not even a tiny bit threatening. And I knew, Gene, that's not what you and I are supposed to do.
No, I spent, and I'm kind of ashamed to admit this, but not as ashamed as I should be. I was in total radio silence for most of the week in terms of the goings on in Milwaukee. I mean, I was strictly print in terms of my whatever information I was getting. Didn't listen to the radio. I did it mostly for my wife, who worries about my health whenever I hear anything, from emanating from Trump and or his minions. They used to call it apoplexy, but I maybe it's still called that. But the state I get into, I get so wound up that I find myself yearning, as you did, for an escape hatch. And the escape hatches I find are in the movies that I used to see. And I guess that's partly because there are so few movies to see in the theaters that I'm back in the 70s and 60s and even the 80s to sort of retrieve something resembling, not, maybe escape is the wrong word. Maybe, again, to get back to what I said earlier, something that protects what little hope I have. I mean, something that keeps, that sort of contains and surrounds the hope. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I've been thinking a lot about our species as I've been calling, I haven't said this out loud, I don't think yet, Homo culturensis, the sense that we are really an animal that lives in culture and extracts meaning from culture and has a constant, not just dialogue, but one foot in the sort of quote unquote reality and culture. And I know you've been thinking a lot also about the idea of politics as a performance. I mean, Donald Trump is some kind of fusion of Don Rickles and Elvis and the Rat Pack with Sinatra. There's just all kinds of things that go into, and I guess all the, wrestling and fighting stuff that he's so addicted to, that it's, in some ways, I feel like we're not dealing with real people. We're dealing with somebody's guess about what a real person might be like.
Well, it's like we're on the outside looking in of this big show that we're supposed to think has no direct effect on us, but it has a great deal of impact on us. And, as I think I told you earlier, what made this avoidance of the convention so poignant for me is that when I was growing up, I loved watching political conventions. It made me kind of a bit of a geek among my peers, but I was spellbound. This was an era where the outcome of these conventions was pretty much, a given in every case. But I love the minutia. I love whatever little things were being picked up off the floor by the anchors and the reporters. The processes, even the roll call. I mean, it was a great education. And yet, I've lately gotten the uncomfortable feeling that acceptance of politics as entertainment and performance is kind of responsible for getting us where we are now.
Yes, I hear you. And speaking of performance, I know that you want to talk about this, and I think it's really interesting too. I just mentioned Don Rickles. I think we've been living in a Don Rickles America in a way, one that's driven heavily by insult and othering. And I mean,
I'm surprised. I'm kind of surprised no one picked up. You're the only one I know who actually made that direct connection of Rickles and Trump, and I don't know why nobody else has picked up on that.
But his best friend Bob Newhart just died, and it is sort of interesting to think if we've been living in a Rickles America, how we could possibly get to a Newhart America. But I'd love you to say a little.
That's interesting. That's an interesting thought. No, Newhart's an example of somebody who came along at exactly the right time. It was the early 1960s. There was a new kind of mass man coming into being, an organization man, and the whole idea of a comedian who billed himself as a button-down mind was in sync with the way a lot of America was emerging to think of itself as being that kind of professional, that kind of cool, distanced yet utterly harried and harassed professional. Struggling to stay focused despite the chaos, struggling to stay interested, struggling to listen, no matter how absurd the things that happen to you. I mean, and I didn't recognize that at first about Newhart. I mean, I thought he was a reasonably funny guy, but when I listened to some of the stuff that he did in the early 60s, like the driving instructor and the Empire State Guard who suddenly sees King Kong climbing the building. I hear all this minutia at the side, of like trying to do his job and all the things he's trying to keep professional decorum up while this giant ape is dragging this half-naked woman up the side of his building. And it strikes me that Newhart was at once on time and very much ahead of the curve, and that kind of presence, which I think we all identified with, or at least understood when we watched his sitcoms, the guy who was constantly being assaulted by all these absurd people in his life, whether it was in Chicago at his psychiatrist's office or whether it was at the Country Inn in Vermont. The kind of America where you're not surprised by anything. You're just kind of thrown by it, and yet you live with it. You don't welcome it exactly, but you're ready for it, and you, instead of constantly finding reasons to demean it. And I mean, the fact that we lost Newhart on a week like this makes one yearn for the very thing that he embodied.
Yes.
That kind of. I
have a friend from high school who recently said to me, life is about 80% coping. And Newhart was the great coper. He was our coper in chief. Hey, Gene, we have to wrap up here.
He was the great coper, exactly.
Our friend Noah's going to be on in a little while, Gene, and I'm going to talk to the sculptor Susan Clinard. So we have to say goodbye, but I want to read your Newhart piece as soon as you get it done, and we'll take a break and we'll come back.
Sun to rise and shine and still give us the wind. Can you hear me?
A few quick thank yous. Gina Amatruda, the Jedi Master, is our technical producer today. Jonathan McPants is the producer of this episode. He's had quite a week. He was fighting a cold for a lot of the week. We made this show up kind of out of nothing, and we had to change our Wednesday show. We had to work on that. It's been, everybody's had to do a lot of work. And I also want to just take a moment to thank three people who are more or less our bosses, but they're sort of more than that. That would be Katie Tolarski, Meg Dalton, and Robin Doyon Aiken. and as we started to talk about this show today, all of them said people will need a show like this one on Friday. They really cheered us on, and it helped a lot. All right, joining us now is somebody who I deeply, deeply admire, and started that the minute I met her. Susan Clinard is the owner of Clinard Sculpture Studio in Hamden, and she is somebody who creates very, very powerful work, and has a lot to say about it. Susan, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Colin. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be back.
We should just start with how you're feeling right now, how you're feeling about the state of the world, which I know isn't necessarily a pleasant subject for you.
No, it's I'm definitely on edge. I'm anxious. Feel like I've been sitting in a long theater performance, and I'm trying to find out if it's real or not. And so there's a fair amount of anxiety. I'm not going to lie.
I had a conversation earlier in the show with Reverend Benjamin Perry, who talked about the fact that you can't get to hope unless you completely acknowledge the darkness. You acknowledge what's bothering you. And I think back to, there was a period of time just within the last few years where I was going through a really, really tough period. And when you found out about that, you sent me a small sculpture. And it wasn't a happy sculpture. It was, in fact, a very lonely looking figure in a boat, arms kind of folded, head bowed. And it didn't cheer me up, but it actually helped me see the situation that I was in a little bit more clearly, which I think is some of the work that creative people like you do. Could you maybe say a little bit about how your imagination interacts with your feelings about the world and then causes you to make things out of substances and that we can all see?
Sure. And I sent that boat to you because I knew you would get it, and I knew you are an incredibly wise human being and a deeply sensitive human being. So I thought, Colin will understand this, and will, and I'm so grateful that you do. And I mean, in 30 some odd years of creating art, I've never shied away from making work that, touches upon our difficult times and difficult stages we're in life, and what we're pushing through, and also joyous periods. And it's funny, I just had a group of visitors, older visitors, walk through the studio, and they said, "Oh, please tell us about this piece. Oh, please tell us about that piece." And before I know it, I was referring to pieces that were actually, most of them were in direct response to some things that were like very difficult for me to swallow during the Trump administration, that affected people's lives that I loved very dearly, and it dehumanized people that I loved. And I thought, I'm not an articulate person with my words, but let me touch some clay, or grab some wood and see what I can come up with. And as a response to having a visual reminder of what we might all be feeling and pushing through, but let it be just that example in front of you that you can absorb whatever you can from it, and take it home and even let it settle a little longer. But it was apparent to me that I was super prolific during his 4 years because I was in constant response mode, where I feel like lately I've been more introspective and quieter, and trying to tap into like more peaceful ways of just pushing through this life. But you can't be afraid of the heavy. Mm-hmm. You cannot be afraid of the heavy if you want that joy, because they are together. They are brother and sister. And when I saw, watching the convention last night and seeing the scanning the audience with some of the posters, just awful. I mean, making my stomach churn. And I thought, it's not just him. It's so many people feeling these fears right now, and are fighting in very, very loud ways. But there's other ways that we can combat that. And And I'm reminded by just the people that I deal with on a daily basis in my community. And I look behind me and I'm like, yes, you're here. You are beautiful and you are loud, even though you're not being loud. Your footprints on the ground and caring and loving for others and being a listening ear and stepping up when you're not asked to be stepped up. Like all of these things are so deeply inspiring to me. And these human beings are all around us all the time. And I'm not letting go of them because they're the ones that are going to help us through this time.
Susan Clinard, just wonderful place to end. And thank you so much for the work that you do and for the time that you spend with us, owner of Clinard Sculpture Studio in Hamden. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you, Colin.
And then let's switch over to another creative person, Noah Baerman, a pianist, composer, and educator. His new album from the Noah Baerman Trio is Live at the Side Door. I should say that we're going to end the show with your version, Noah, of The Healer that's on the album. I've listened so much over the last few years to the version of The Healer you did with Ron Carter, and it's actually been a pretty powerful thing in my own life. But I guess, I was reading, this is such a pretentious thing to say, I was reading Marcus Aurelius today, and at one point he says something like wrestling is a better preparation for life than dancing. Ideally, Noah, I think we would do both. But I think I know what he means too, which is you have to be prepared for a lot of unexpected things that will be thrown at you.
That's absolutely true. Thank you for the kind words, by the way, and thank you to all the people who've offered their wisdom and soul on this program. I think. For me, I've been thinking this week about the distinction between transcendence and avoidance, or like escape. And so much of the music that I value, most of the music that I value, to me has that quality of leaning into something, leaning into what's real, leaning into truth and all the emotional complexities that go along with that, and trying to find strength as I suppose you wrestle with that, as opposed to, distraction is tempting, and I certainly do not want to demean anybody whose relationship with music is more in that sort of placation mindset, but this is not why I continue to make music.
But let's talk about why you continue to make music too, because I think, one of the mysterious things for everybody else is that moment when somebody who's creative says, okay, I'm going to make a thing right now. I need to make a thing right now, whether it's a sculpture or a jazz composition or a short story. And I don't know, I guess I want you to maybe talk a little bit about what you feel inside you that you need to translate into music, particularly at, say, a troubling time.
Well, I guess for me, I don't know if this is why I gravitated towards music, but one of the reasons I stick with it is that there are emotions and states of experience which include, though are not limited to, dread and grief and other things that are challenging, that just for which words aren't adequate. And as people who've heard me on your show before know, I like words, but there are certain states where that need to process something that's otherwise just bouncing around, trying to find some kind of coherence. That's what I'm seeking. That's what sound allows me to process, and I like to think on a good day convey to others who need some kind of vehicle through which to process whatever they're dealing with.
Yeah, when I listen to your work, and I know you pretty well, and we talk, and it's so clear that probably the biggest tradition throbbing through your work is the Black American musical tradition, which is so much about trouble and about just incredible sorrow, pain, confinement, and somehow or other the capability also to mine that for joy. It is, we're having a bad week. This is a response to bad centuries, and somehow or other, it's kind of all there in that music. Maybe you could say a little bit about how you relate to that.
Well, yeah, I guess I don't see joy and struggle as being as much of a binary duality as we might think. And it's interesting, the blues are portrayed as being sad music, like that's the oversimplified version. But to me, the blues are heroic and transcendent, and they just demonstrate this depth of spirit of yearning for and reaching for and having some kind of possibly irrational faith in release from, I mean, I really don't want to over dramatize the tie-in with the history of Black folks in the United States, but this pursuit of freedom, whatever that means, and this sort of internalized pursuit of being free from these literal and or inner states. I mean, that's literal too, I suppose, but the external and internal states that oppress us. And, you know, it's that feeling of quest of for transcendence is, to me, I mean, that's when I was, some people have heard the story before, but when I was a little kid and I pointed to the TV when Stevie Wonder was performing on Sesame Street and I said, that's what I'm going to do. It's taken me the ensuing 45 years and will take me the rest of my life to understand the essence of what that was. And yes, it was fun, and yes, it was funky, and yes, it sounded good, but there was just like a godly strength, and I'm not a religious person, but like a strength of spirit that to me just could wrestle anybody to the ground, basically.
Yeah, I think there's, you know, one of the verbs that we use about music a lot is the verb lift. It lifts up our hearts, it lifts up our souls, it lifts us. And that, whether you decide to make that secular or religious, is, I think, maybe some of what you hear, what you heard in Stevie. I'm going to give you 25 seconds to answer just because I want to play at least a minute of your song. Sure. So it's all for you, Noah. But yeah, anything you want to say?
I just want to honor that this week, under the radar of national politics, we lost Bernice Johnson Reagan, who is best known as the leader of Sweet Honey and the Rock. And I encourage people to check out her work. She is to me, the ultimate role model for caring deeply about humans and manifesting that in music without the music being dour or, you know, it really shows that uplift while looking square at what is difficult in human existence.
All right. I'm going to say goodbye, and I'm not going to say anything else so we can hear a lot of Noah Baerman's beautiful song, The Healer.
Thank you.